Welcome to the February warm-up program of the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. Thank you so much. My name is Don Patton. Harold and I formed the roundtable 27 years ago, and I want to introduce our historian, our speaker, author of the book Brothers, Rivals, Victors. It is a biography of and kind of intermingling of careers of Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley. It's a wonderful read. It talks about their idiosyncrasies, their quirks, their rivalries, and reveals how the war was won with some very different personalities, very different people. John has done a marvelous job on the book. I hope you'll decide to pick up one in the lobby. And John, we're anxious to hear your report on your book. And by the way, I will tell you this: his father was in the Air Force. He lived in many places. He got a degree from Stanford in Birmingham. He got his law degree from Vanderbilt. Is in a large law firm in Atlanta. He came up a day early so that he missed the storm that would have prevented him from being here. And it's been a thrill to spend some time knowing him. He don't hold against him being a lawyer. He's a wonderful writer, a wonderful historian, and you're going to enjoy his presentation.
Thank you all to the supporters of the World War II Roundtable for coming out on this frosty February night so we can have some fun talking about three iconic American generals. As Don mentioned, the title of tonight's story is Brothers, Rivals, Victors. And those three words of the title are about the only part of the book, this big book, that I didn't take out and didn't get cut up and slashed and put back in and sliced, diced, and excised in the 5 years that I spent researching this story. And the reason those three words alone survived 5 years of editorial bloodletting is because they sum up an evolution of a friendship, a relationship that changed over 30 years before Pearl Harbor. It started out as a friendship among three American officers. It turned into a command relationship that was testy and tense at times, and it ultimately became a material component of the Allied victory in Europe. So tonight we're going to talk about how this team of Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley became the team of Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley. And to do that, we've got to roll back 30 years before Pearl Harbor. We've got to go back to the time of the old Army, the time of the Army that just a generation before had tamed the American West. It was the Army that hadn't yet tangled with Pancho Villa and had never seen the shores of Europe. And that started about 102 years ago at the United States Military Academy in West Point, New York, in August of 1911. It started when a cadet from Abilene, Kansas, who, for all practical purposes, had never left the state of Kansas in his life, met another cadet named Omar Bradley, who had, for all practical purposes, never even left Randolph County, Missouri in his life. Now, the two cadets, Dwight Eisenhower, universally known as Ike, and Bradley, of course known to his friends as Brad, became close at the academy. Now, as a military academy, West Point, of course, is designed to instill a sense of military mindset into its graduates. But Ike and Brad were not really of that type, at least when they were at the academy together. Neither was a particularly outstanding student. They were kind of middle-of-the-pack students. Ike was a notorious rule breaker, especially when those rules concerned things like cigarettes and curfews. Omar Bradley was a pretty good solid soldier. He outranked Eisenhower by the time they were both seniors, but he wasn't the kind of guy who would stand out on either the parade ground or in the classroom. He wasn't the sort who would be in the middle of a crowd, the center of attention. He was the kind of guy who would stand off on the periphery. But while these two young men were not outstanding students, and they weren't outstanding on the parade ground, they did have something in common, something that built the foundation of a friendship that would last to the end of their days. That was their love of team sports. Eisenhower's sport was football. He was a solid defensive tackle. He was an above-average plunging back, which today we would call a running back, and he cracked helmets with sports legend Jim Thorpe during his football playing career. Ultimately, in a game, he sustained a knee injury that sidelined his sports career. It very nearly sidelined his military career, too. He had to do some fast talking with the physician to sign off for his lieutenant's commission. But even after that injury, Eisenhower wanted to be a part of the West Point football team. He helped cheerlead from the sidelines, he assisted the coaches, he learned the art of coaching, and even if he couldn't be the one carrying the ball, he wanted to be a part of the team. And it was that team coaching mindset that Eisenhower would take with him out of West Point, and it would change his management style in the years ahead when the teams got bigger and the plays became vastly more complicated. Omar Bradley loved football too. As you can see from this photograph, he played on the football team with Ike. This is a picture of the 1915 West Point squad, and the young man in the dark coat with the very fine head of hair, which I can appreciate. On the left is young cadet Eisenhower, and at the other end of the football line, also expanded wearing the helmet, is young Bradley. The two young men played together on the football team, but frankly, Brad's passion was not on the gridiron. It was on the diamond. Brad had a rocket launcher of a throwing arm. For years, he held the West Point record for longest throw. He was an outstanding relief pitcher, and his senior year, he swung his Louisville Slugger to a .383 batting average. To put that in perspective, that's about the same average that Kirby Puckett had his fantastic rookie year. So he was a real heavy hitter. And the love of team sports, the ability to take a group of people and get them working together, was a cement that would create a friendship that would last to the end of both men's days. Well, after graduation from West Point, Brad and Ike had one more thing in common that they would take with them and carry with them for the next couple of decades. They both missed out on the big show. That would be the Great War, the war to end all wars. It was the war that their friends went off to Europe to fight, and their friends came back with chestfuls of medals and battlefield experience and combat reputations and promotions. Unfortunately for the two of them, they never got anywhere close to France. Bradley's luckless regiment, the 14th Infantry, was spread out on guard duty for things like copper mines from Montana up to Alaska. The regiment didn't even begin to assemble to ship off to France until the day armistice was declared, and so it never got any closer to France than Des Moines, Iowa. Ike, who was making a name for himself as a base camp football coach, was an outstanding trainer of men, and he was making a reputation as a good motivator. Now, the Army liked Ike. Everyone liked Ike. But the Army did not want Ike going off to Europe to fight the Kaiser. The Army wanted Ike training other men to go off to fight the Kaiser. So Ike Eisenhower, as a lieutenant colonel, rode out the war to end all wars in Camp Meade, Maryland, training men to fight in these new mechanized beasts the Army was calling tanks. The Brotherhood grew in 1919 when Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower met a hard-charging tank colonel back from France named George Patton. Now, Patton, up until that time, had a storybook career for an Army officer. At West Point and afterward, he excelled at individual sports like fencing or equestrian sports or shooting. He represented the United States in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, finishing 5th. He was the Army's master fencer. He redesigned the cavalry saber, and he chased Pancho Villa around northern Mexico with General Blackjack Pershing. When war came to America's shores in 1917, Patton was one of the first officers to ship off to Europe with Pershing. He was involved in 2 major offenses, and he was wounded at the first day of the Meuse-Argonne attack in September 1918. Patton, then a colonel, was recovering from his wound on November the 11th, 1918, which was a date doubly significant to him. It was his 33rd birthday, and it was the date the bells rang out in celebration of the armistice. Years later, one of General Bradley's aides would comment, "Armistice Day and Patton's birthday, the 2 are incompatible." Well, Patton came home to America, frankly, a depressed man. While most people were at least paying lip service, even Army officers who wanted to advance their careers, to the idea that we're all glad the casualty lists were coming to an end, Patton didn't make any bones about it. He saw his chance of glory, his chance of being remembered by people in the future taken from him after 2 measly days of combat in the only war he would probably ever see. But Patton's hopes were revived when he met this optimistic young lieutenant colonel named Ike, who, like Patton, commanded a tank battalion. Here we see a picture of Patton on the left and Ike, not looking quite so dapper as Patton, on the far right. And in the middle, we see a picture of the 1920 U.S. Tank Corps. That's about 3/4 of the men in the Tank Corps right there in the picture. And inside that circle, we see the only known photograph of Patton and Eisenhower as 2 young officers sitting next to each other in the Tank Corps. At Camp Meade, Ike and George, as they knew each other, spent many a day experimenting with tanks. They fired new weapons together. They took pieces of tanks apart and put them back together without even having bolts left over. They worked out tactics and different combinations of armor and infantry and tried to think about the way these odd mechanical beasts would affect the shape of future wars. It was this intrigue and intellectual pursuit of the way these wars would be fought that shaped a friendship that would last almost to the end of Patton's days. Well, Ike and George, in some ways, were really the odd couple. Patton grew up in an isolated part of Southern California. He had 1 sibling, a sister. He had a rather wealthy insular family, and as a result, he grew up as an introvert. And by introvert, I mean somebody who draws his energy from within, someone who wants quiet to work through things. When Patton wanted to solve a problem, he didn't collaborate with a team as others might. He would go off by himself. He would think about it. He would read about it. He would meditate on it, even pray about it. And then he would come back with what he felt the solution should be. He loved reading history, so he would be right at home here, and he drew many of his inspirations from historical examples of medieval or Napoleonic times. Now, Eisenhower, by contrast, came from a middle-class family. 7 hungry, strapping boys. No girls. He went to public school in Abilene, Kansas, which is about as middle-class, middle American a town as you'd ever find, either back then or today. On the playgrounds and alleyways of Abilene, Ike Eisenhower learned when to stand up for himself, when to be diplomatic and back off. He learned when to cultivate allies like his older brothers, and he learned when to fight. Most of all, he developed that touch for the common man that would affect his career, not only in the Army, but also in politics for many years later. Well, by the end of their assignment to Camp Meade, Ike and George had become close friends. Ike and Mamie were frequent guests at the Patton household. The Pattons lived right next door to them. And George's 2 girls loved playing with the little Eisenhower toddler, a young lad nicknamed Icky. But in 1920, the Army broke up the Tank Corps. So Patton went back to the cavalry from whence he came, and Eisenhower stuck around with the infantry so he could remain with tanks a little longer. Well, the final side of the triangle dropped into place in Hawaii in the mid-1920s. It occurred when Colonel Patton, then stationed with the Hawaiian Division, organized a trap shooting team. A young major named Omar Bradley showed up to try out for Patton's team. Now, Bradley was one of the Army's great shots at the time. He had hunted since he was a young man, and he was a crack shot with the Springfield rifle. When he tried out for Patton's team, he was a little rattled at first, and he missed his first 2 clays. But then he hit the next 23 right in a row. Just like clockwork, he got into a rhythm, 92%. And Patton, looking over his shoulder and watching Bradley, just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Yeah, you'll do, I think." Well, that wasn't an especially auspicious beginning to a relationship. And frankly, it probably wasn't ever going to be a wonderful bosom buddy relationship because they were just vastly different people. Brad, you see, was a quiet, somewhat shy man. He grew up in a very small home in rural Missouri. He was an only child, and his father died when he was 14, leaving the family with no means of support. So his mother had to take in boarders, and he shot squirrels and rabbits to sell to neighbors as income. That was how they supported themselves. Then when Brad was 17, he was in a skating accident that smashed up his teeth and jaw and left them disfigured. Now, I don't know if you remember how confident you all were when you were 17. I wasn't that much. And having a disfigured smile doesn't exactly make you swell up with social confidence, does it? Well, Brad's family couldn't possibly afford to get his teeth fixed, so he went through his young adulthood ashamed of the way he looked, very self-conscious about his smile. Even after he got his teeth replaced with dentures, he would keep a tight-lipped grimace whenever he thought something was funny. It's a lot like the picture on the book, kind of a You see, Bradley was always concerned about what people were thinking about him, and so he never really liked to draw attention to himself. He stifled the urge to get a good belly laugh, or basically to be a loud character. He was also not much of a social lion. His wife, Mary, was an ardent teetotaler who objected to the kind of woodshed beer or bathtub gin that the Eisenhowers and Pattons liked to cook up during Prohibition. Bradley was a simple man, and he had simple tastes. He loved ice cream, vanilla mostly. He drank Coca-Cola by the case, and that would make him popular in my hometown. And he had numerous food allergies that kept him on a very unspectacular diet. For that reason, Omar Bradley lacked some of the social confidence that many of his peers, the Pattons and the Eisenhowers, for instance, carried with them. And that would come home to roost later on as Bradley worked his way up into the Army's elite and began to mix and mingle in Africa, the Mediterranean, and Europe with the more cultured people, the royalty of Europe, with prime ministers, with upper-level generals. And we know that those British were extremely sophisticated because they spoke French. Now, we need to remember that back in 1939, as war clouds broke over the horizon in Europe, the United States was woefully unprepared. The United States Army was the 17th largest army in the world. It was about 1/3 the size of the Belgian army. It was smaller than the Bulgarian army. It was even smaller than the neutrals, Switzerland and Sweden. So yes, there were actually more guys with those little red pocket knives running around than we had in our entire army. The U.S. just wasn't ready for war. But there was another side to that coin. It meant that with a small officer corps in the interwar years, then American officers like General Marshall, Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley, they got to know other officers, either directly, personally, or by reputation. And as a result, people like General George Marshall, the Army's chief of staff, were able to reach out and pluck up people who they knew to be capable officers, and that helped Marshall select the leaders for the big operations. Now, Eisenhower's reputation as a staff officer was excellent. He served with the Third Army and other places and made a name for himself as a staffer. And as a result, General Marshall tapped Ike to lead the invasion of North Africa, which we now know as Operation Torch. Well, like Marshall, Eisenhower looked back to his pre-war days, and he selected his old friend George Patton to lead the invasion of Africa's treacherous Atlantic coast. Now, Patton's landings were a success. He was tapped to invade French Morocco, and he captured his main objective, Casablanca, within 3 days. And 3 months later, when the Americans got their teeth kicked in Tunisia at a place called Kasserine Pass, Ike reached back across Africa and asked his old friend George Patton if he would come to Tunisia and take the reins of the U.S. Second Corps. Well, Patton obliged his friend, and the first thing he did was ask Ike to give him Major General Omar Bradley as his deputy corps commander. So with that, the brotherhood of West Point and Camp Meade and Hawaii had turned itself into a true combat command team. Now, I suppose it was inevitable that during the war, these three intelligent, headstrong, ambitious young men, now middle-aged, would see each other as rivals of sorts. Now, this was a bit unusual for a rivalry because it wasn't a rivalry for power. It wasn't a rivalry even for position, because all three men understood and accepted the role that General Marshall gave them. This was actually a rivalry, more like a sibling rivalry, a rivalry for being right, a rivalry for proving that each man's methods and his ideas were the best way for the Army to win the war in Europe. It was a rivalry to prove that each was top dog. And this rivalry bubbled over eventually into a sense of frustration. And that frustration, in turn, bubbled over in Sicily. One ingredient in the rivalry was their professional outlook. Patton grew up in the cavalry, and to Patton, an army was a lot like a horse. A horse, of course, is a big, beautiful animal. It can move quickly, but it also eats a lot of food. And if left in one place in a battlefield, you're going to find it vulnerable to bullets and shells. So you've got to keep that horse moving quickly, or it's going to get mowed down. George Patton felt that an army was subject to many of the same rules as a horse column. Attack, attack, attack. That was the Patton philosophy. Patton believed that if you just keep your army moving, if you keep attacking it until the last ounce of gas is drained from your tanks, then you'll have fewer casualties and everybody can go home faster. Violent execution was the Patton mantra. But this philosophy gave Patton's subordinate, Omar Bradley, fits. Because to Bradley, Patton was so wrapped up in this attack, attack, attack stuff that he kept forgetting the fundamental things, prosaic things that really make a difference. Things such as logistics. How do we get the gas and the beans and the bullets to the guy on the front line? What about air support? How do we call that in or let the bombers know where to go? What about safe, solid front lines or secure flanks? To Patton, or to Bradley, I should say, Patton was the kind of guy who was so wrapped up in the offensive that other men were eventually going to have to pay the price for Patton's rashness. Well, here's how I describe in the book the difference between the two men's approaches. Tactics to Omar was a type of mathematical problem solving. Like a scholar working on an algebraic proof, Brad took the known X and Y factors, logistics, and intelligence, and he used them to derive Z, the operational plan. If everyone did their jobs, the course of events would fall into place naturally and predictably. The secret to Bradley's success, the engine of his genius, was his ability to grasp all parts of a monstrous moving battlefield and derive from them a plan in which the foot soldier on the front line could have confidence. Patton, by contrast, would never think of letting his staff sit in the driver's seat and then sitting back as a figurehead. Driven by a powerful sense of self-aggrandizement, an insatiable thirst for approval, and an overpowering feeling of destiny, George invariably turned to the offense, the logistics man be damned. He broke away from his command post, led from the front, and he disregarded rules that stood between him and his objective. His outstanding performance at the Louisiana maneuvers in 1941 had taught George that accepted doctrine was a fine thing to follow until it conflicted with the requirements of victory. When that happened, doctrine would invariably get the boot in favor of whatever worked. Patton's ability to look beyond the rules, a sixth sense built over years of experimentation, study, even prayer, was what gave Patton his touch of genius. Well, Eisenhower, the man in the middle, was the staff officer. His heart was with the infantry, and he was more of a team player like Bradley was. But in the end, he was basically the team's general manager. He would fire players. He might even trade them. He did that once to General Jacob Devers, whom he didn't like. And in the end, he got to make the big calls. He might change out the defense or sub in a new player for the offense. He was a lot like Bradley in his team sport mentality, but unlike Bradley, he had the ability to look at an individualist like George Patton and realize that the Allies could use such a man if they could find the right place to put him and if they kept him out of the wrong places. And one of those wrong places stemmed from Patton's personality. The fact is, they all had to deal with it. It was their cross to bear. Long after the war, Ike wrote, "George Patton loved to shock people. Anything that popped into his mind promptly came out of his mouth, especially if it was bizarre. He loved to shake members at a social gathering by exploding a few rounds of outrageous profanity. If it created any effect, he would indulge in more of the same. If no one paid any attention, he would quiet down." Sounds like my youngest. In the late 1930s, when he was commanding the 3rd Cavalry Regiment stationed at Fort Myer in Washington, Colonel Patton would often go out for morning horseback rides with the Army's Chief of Staff, General Marshall. And sometimes those two men would bring along Marshall's wife, Catherine. Well, after one particularly curse-laden tirade by Patton in front of Catherine Marshall, Catherine turned to Patton and she said to him in that tone that only women can get away with, "George, you mustn't talk like that. You say these outrageous things and then you look at me to see if I'm going to smile. Now, you could do that as a captain or a major, but you aspire to be a general, and a general cannot talk in any such wild way." Well, it was this clash of outlooks that fractured Patton's relationship with Bradley in Sicily, and Eisenhower had to come down on Patton 2 times during that campaign. First, for not keeping him as the supreme commander informed of what he was doing around the time of the landings, and second, more famously, for slapping 2 enlisted men toward the end of the campaign. Patton ended up in the doghouse, frankly. Bradley spent a lot of time back stateside bad-mouthing Patton to George Marshall, everybody's boss. And Eisenhower had to tell Marshall that he was having some problems with the Army's enfant terrible. But Marshall saw this as Eisenhower's problem. He said, "Ike is the theater commander," and his view was that he would support Eisenhower, and Marshall was not going to meddle. During the spring of 1944, when Bradley and Eisenhower were selecting their field commanders for the Overlord invasion of France, Bradley was tremendously unhappy to find out that Eisenhower had picked Patton to lead one of the 2 armies Bradley would ultimately command. He would lead the 3rd Army, the army that would be activated about a month after D-Day. Brad was so unhappy to be working with Patton again, even in a role as Patton's boss, that the night before the big Normandy landings aboard the command ship, when they had plenty of other things they might be doing, Brad and his staffers sat around chewing the fat about their favorite Georgie Patton stories, which were all designed to make their former and future subordinate look like a buffoon. Well, it wasn't a great start, just like that trap team. But during the summer of 1944, Patton's army was activated, and the 2 men worked very well together. Patton, just glad to be in the fight in any role, happily did whatever Bradley asked him to do. And while they had a few arguments at the very beginning, they became a pretty good team. But they didn't become a good team because their outlook had changed, or their philosophies had changed, or their personalities changed. They became a good team because now they were at last on the continent of Europe and they could close with the enemy. They had an enemy that was within their grasp that they would be able to fight. It was an enemy that would bind the 2 of them together. Yeah. In the summer of 1944, the Allies ran out of gas, didn't they? It wasn't that they didn't have it. We had plenty of gas, but it was piling up on the Normandy beaches, and we couldn't get it up to the front lines. What made things even worse was that in the month before D-Day, Allied bombers had bombed the French rail network into the Stone Age because they were trying to keep the Germans from reinforcing the beachhead. Well, what's the solution to this? The sweatered one, as Bradley's aide called him, came up with a proposal, which we later called the dagger thrust. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's proposal was, Ike, give me all the gas. Ike, give me all the ammunition. Ike, give me an American army to guard my flank, and I will drive through the Ruhr, through northern Germany, straight to Berlin, and I will plant the Union Jack on top of the Brandenburg Gate. That was his idea. Well, that, of course, did not play well with Bradley or Patton, because that would give the lion's share of credit to the British. Bradley and Patton refused to cotton to that. They despised Montgomery. I think it was Winston Churchill who called Montgomery indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. And that was probably about right. Certainly Bradley and Patton thought he was insufferable at any time, and that he rarely advanced as fast as they thought he should. They actually talked a number of times about telling Ike that they would hand in their resignations rather than continue to play second fiddle to Montgomery. But Eisenhower's view was what we know to history as the broad front. He said, the Allies are going to move up together. Monty, I'm not going to give you all the gas. We're all going to move up and close in on the Rhine, and then we're going to see what we can do. They would not move as quickly as Montgomery promised they would, but they would move steadily, kind of like what Grant did with the Confederacy in 1864. It was a broad steamroller. And that's what Eisenhower eventually did, and that ended up working to Bradley's benefit because the Americans at that point outnumbered the number of Commonwealth troops in Europe. The pressures of personality all came to a head in 1944, in December of that year, when Hitler launched his 250,000-man attack out of the Ardennes forest, in what, of course, we know now as the Battle of the Bulge. Well, the Bulge, as you can see from this map, was stuck into the center of the Allied line. That shaded area around the word Belgium is basically where the panzers cut. And that was a particular problem for Bradley because Bradley's headquarters was at Luxembourg City on the south side of the Bulge. Patton's headquarters and his whole army was also on the south side of the Bulge. But two other armies that Bradley was commanding, the First Army and under Courtney Hodges and Bill Simpson's Ninth Army, were on the north side of the Bulge. And in a day when we didn't have satellite transmissions or cell phones, what that meant was communications between Brad's headquarters and First Army headquarters were spotty. The lines had to keep moving back further and further, and even the radio transmitters they set up as a chain to move communications back and forth were not working well enough to manage a crisis that was unfolding hour by hour, day by day. So what was the solution? Well, Eisenhower, thinking about it and talking it over with some of his staffers, decided to do what to Omar Bradley was the ultimate slap in the face. He took the 1st and 9th Army out from under Bradley's army group and he gave them to Montgomery, the man whom, aside from maybe Hitler and Goering, Brad probably despised more than anybody else in the European theater. On December 20th, after thinking about the predicament he'd gotten in and realizing that he didn't jump out in front of this crisis fast enough, Brad got frustrated and he eventually told Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people for what's going to happen if you change our command chain. I resign. It was a hot conversation. Eisenhower said, Brad, I'm the one who's responsible to the American people for this, and your resignation means nothing to me. Well, Eisenhower was a good poker player, and he knew when Brad was bluffing. But nonetheless, he smoothed things over. He got Bradley a medal, and he had Winston Churchill say some nice things about Bradley on the floor of the House of Commons. So it eventually smoothed out. Patton worked from the south side of the Bulge, and eventually Montgomery used the First Army and elements of British Second Army on the north side of the Bulge, and we got the Bulge erased by, say, the middle of January. We were able to move into Germany. By April of 1945, the Third Reich was in its final gasps. Hitler was dead, Roosevelt was dead, and the following month, the Third Reich was dead. The war was over in Europe, and there was no way for Patton, Bradley, or Eisenhower really to have much of a role in the Pacific. For Eisenhower, his career was just beginning, however. He was appointed U.S. Army Chief of Staff, succeeding his mentor, General Marshall. He later became obviously President of the United States, and he was viewed, I think, as kind of the Ulysses Grant of the Second World War. Bradley went on to run the Veterans Administration, doing a creditable job of reshaping that agency right after the war, and he would eventually succeed his friend Eisenhower as the Army's top general and become the last of the 5 stars. Now, Patton, as he predicted in a letter to his wife, would be a nuisance. He couldn't adjust to the realities of peacetime life, realities where politics trumped military strategy. Ultimately, his comments about being soft on the Nazis and hard on the communists got him fired by a reluctant Eisenhower, whom Patton never really forgave until the day he died in December of that year. Well, in 1942, there were about 1,000 general officers in the Army's rolls. There were also a few hundred flag-ranked admirals. But of this, say, 1,300 person group, how many of them do we really remember today? How many does the common person on the street know? Well, we remember MacArthur, of course, and probably Admiral Chester Nimitz, and we remember George Marshall. Some people may remember Jimmy Doolittle or Vinegar Joe Stilwell, and those who have done a fair amount of reading would remember General Chennault. They might remember Courtney Hodges or Bob Eichelberger. But in the main, it was Eisenhower, the liberator of Europe, and his 2 lead horses, Patton and Bradley, whose names nowadays adorn schools, statues, silver dollars, tanks, fighting vehicles, and of course, the roster of American presidents. They bludgeoned their way through the Third Reich, and they helped sink the dagger into Hitler's Europe. The 3 men's collaboration was a material part of the Allied victory in Europe. But the imprint these 3 men left on the American consciousness in the decades that followed, in the generations that followed, may really be their lasting victory. Thank you.
We didn't have anybody that served with Patton, Bradley, or Eisenhower. But we have 3 veterans that did some very significant things in the war, as everybody does, oftentimes not to get recognized. To your left is Marty Romano. He was in the Navy on PT boats. Bob Maynard in the center was an artillery lieutenant that became part of the OSS. And on the your right is Wayne Johnson. He likes to be called Whitey. Marty was born in Jersey City, still has a little bit of an accent. Graduated from Dickinson High School and became a machinist. Was recruited by the Army, but ended up going in the Navy. You told me that the Army wanted you first, Uncle Sam. 1943, he got into boot camp at Newport, went up to Boston, selected PT boats, did his training at Quonset Bay in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, went to Bayonne, New Jersey, probably stopped by to see the folks too, right? No. Boarded the USS Ranger and headed to North Africa. He got to North Africa, what's the Navy word? Disembarked from the Ranger at Casablanca, which John just told us was occupied by Torch, liberated by Torch. And Marty, tell us what happened after you got ashore at Casablanca.
Before I I say another word, to follow you is fantastic. And to put me in this file, I hope I can live up to your kind words, Don.
You're the hero.
Please accept my use of the printed word at my age. It allows me to focus on what I have to say, otherwise I will drift off. And I do want to finish in the allotted 10 to 15 minutes. Tonight I will introduce you to Squadron 22. We call it Ron 22. And share with you some of the events that I had experienced. Some were interesting. However, most were routine while serving in the Mediterranean theater of operation. Now, what was my role in Ron 22? I was a member at first, Ron 15, when I left the States. When I got to Sardinia and Corsica in April of '44, I was reassigned to 22 and assigned as an engineer aboard the 306. By that time, North Africa campaign was completed, Sicily was captured, Salerno was in Allied hands, and Anzio was in the mopping up phase. This is where I came in to that theater. Now, Don mentioned on how and when I got into the Navy, especially PT boats, leading up to our encounters with the military leaders of World War II in the Mediterranean. Don, ladies and gentlemen, let me recap some of those comments. As Don said, I was born in New Jersey, and in September of '43, I was introduced to the Navy. I was inducted in the Navy at Newark, New Jersey, went to Newport, Rhode Island boot camp. From there, I went to Boston. There, I volunteered for PT boats and sent to Melville for training. I completed my training in May of '44 and was assigned to Ron 15. Sent to Bayonne. Incidentally, Bayonne is next to Jersey City. I tried to get off, couldn't do it.
That's Jersey City.
Jersey City. Hey, watch it. I boarded the Ranger, was an aircraft carrier, and we crossed the Atlantic and landed in Casablanca. I then traveled in cattle cars along the northern African coast to Algiers, or ran on to Tunis, on my way to catch up with Ron 15, which at that time was based in Maddalena Island between Sardinia and Corsica. Corsica, Sardinia, off the Italian west coast. However, Don did not say how I crossed North Africa. 60 to 70 of us were sandwiched into those miserable cattle cars for days. The same cattle cars that the Germans transported the Jews to concentration camps. For food, wow, we had C rations and K rations. For sanitary conditions and sanitary needs, wow. We had to deal with the engineer. One toot, and of his whistle, it would alert us that a station was coming up or a forest was coming due. Two toots, get on board, we're leaving. And here we are running out. And outside of Algiers, we were greeted. Yeah, that was another thing. As we left Algiers, we were greeted with an infestation of locusts. So that was my trip from Casablanca to northern Africa to Tunis. In May and June of '44, from Sardinia, I was sent up to Bastia, Corsica. Corsica is like a it's shaped like this with a snout up here, and Bastia is right at the bottom of that whatever you want to call it. And I was transferred to Squadron 22. I was assigned to the 306 boat as an engineer. I completed my first 63 missions, but it took 3 attempts. Can you imagine? 3 attempts. I believe we picked up a spy at the first night. Now that mission was along the northwest coast of Italy. I have to admit, a very eerie feeling came over me when I saw the Italian coast for the first time. After all, it was the land of my forefathers. Elba. Now, about this time, we invaded Elba, an island just north of Rome, off of Livorno, or Pisa, if you want to call it. Both squadrons, around 15 and around 22, were involved in this operation. It was my understanding that this operation was under the command of the French. As an aside, before the invasion, I happened to be in the town square of Bastia, Corsica, and there and behold was General de Gaulle. Now, General de Gaulle was a tall, gaunt man, very proud. What was he doing? Well, he's rallying the crowd. 3 months later, in August of '44, we were involved in the invasion of southern France. Before the invasion, my boat, the 306, and several other boats traveled to Calvi, Corsica. Calvi, Corsica is at the very tip of the island. The 306 and several other boats, we traveled up to Calvi, Corsica. There we trained with small rubber boats. On August 14th, late in the afternoon, we left Bastia. And at about 32 knots. We caught up with the invasion fleet between Corsica and Italy. We caught up to it, we passed it, and we went on our way. At 1:40 in the morning, on August 15th, we landed at a site between Saint-Tropez and Cannes. That's along the southern Riviera. Thankfully, the minesweepers had cleared the path for us. We picked up the tiny beacon, and we went in. We discharged 69 commandos into those rubber boats. Meanwhile, 4 other PTs teamed up with 3 British gunboats, and they were headed towards Genoa, simulating a big task force. This whole operation, the dropping off of the commandos, the diversion to Genoa, was known under the code name Rosie, and under the command of Lieutenant Commander Douglas Fairbanks, U.S. Navy. Douglas Fairbanks was a well-known actor at that time as a swashbuckler. Someone once asked me what my thoughts were at the time. Actually, to be honest with you, we were just too gone busy. Getting the boats in the water, not talking, whispering, assisting the commandos into the boats, the rubber boats. We all knew what to do, and we went along doing it. And then to get the hell out of there. Did they make it? No. I found out later that one of the commandos tripped a landmine, and later the Germans who opened fire and killed a few of them. Some returned to the drop-off point looking for us, but unfortunately, we had left the area and went on guard duty. The rest were taken prisoners. For the next 2-3 days, along with two other boats, we were assigned to guard a communication ship anchored off the French coast between Nice, Monte Carlo, and San Remo. There were a lot of generals and admirals aboard the ship. Well, we had Admiral King and Admiral Davidson. Generals, we had General Devers, Wilson, Patch, and others. There was just quite a few of them. Our mission was to circle the ship 24 hours a day and to chauffeur them around, the generals and the admirals, from ship to ship or ship to shore. On one such occasion, one trip, I recall coming out of the engine room, and I noticed someone in the back, with 1 foot on the depth charger, with a 45 in khaki, with a 45 stuck in his hip pocket. And I asked one of my shipmates, I says, who is he? He says, why, heck, that's it. That's the Secretary of Navy Forrestal. Oh. Late in the afternoon on the second day, while tied up to the ship, some of us were on deck while others were below. We were relaxing, sleeping, playing cards, or just writing letters when we heard the alarm aboard the ship and the call for general quarters. Within seconds, I quickly jumped down into the engine room, started the engine, and then reported to my battle station, which was the Twin 50s next to the chart house on the starboard Twin 50s. We separated from the ship and laid down a smoke screen around the ship. A German reconnaissance aircraft was detected. By the time that aircraft got into the area, the ship was engulfed in smoke, so it was well protected, well covered. On another occasion, we followed a rowboat into the heavily mined harbor of Nice to pick up maps. The reason the guy we followed knew where the mines were. You could see them as we were going by. You can actually look over, and there they were. You know? The maps were then used by the heavy ships in the harbor, assisting the Army lobbing shells. For relaxation, some of us swam, would you believe it? Some of us swam while the cruisers and battleships were lobbing shells overhead. I wrote to my brother at that time, and I said, Joe, what do you think I just did? And he wrote back, why, you gone crazy? Now, events started to slow down for us after this operation. In September, we went back to Tunis, Africa, for new engines and repairs. And at that time, I got the mandatory shots for the bubonic plague. Then back up to our new base in Gulf de Juan, Antibes, France, southern France. Antibes is between, looking at you, it's between Cannes and Nice. And so it's, we operated out of this base for the next 2 months, and then in November, we operated out of Leghorn, Italy. If you know where Leghorn, Italy is, is north of Rome, slightly northwest of Pisa. And in November and December, December, if I remember, was very, very heavy duty. I believe we went out on mission practically every night, the weather was good or bad. Boy, was I happy when my replacement showed up. And on the 27th of December 1944, I received orders to report to the Fargo building back in Boston after 33 days in the States.
Bob was born in New Jersey, in Patterson. After graduation from high school, he went to Lawrenceville School. He then went to Princeton for 2 years. 41, 43. He was inducted into the Army, went down to basic at Fort Bragg, where he applied for OCS. Went down to Fort Sill, was commissioned in May of 44, a gold bar artilleryman at Fort Sill. Was then transferred to Fort Jackson, where he got into aerial reconnaissance. and at that point was recruited into the OSS. Bob, why don't you take it at that point? What were your qualifications for getting into the OSS, and what did you do after that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank somebody for giving me cover and giving a new name. So Maynard, I'd like it. Well, when I was out of that air-ground liaison course, I was put in a thing called a repo depot, which is a replacement center, and for second lieutenants in the field artillery, that means a life as a forward observer between your guns and the enemy. And if you make a mistake in your mathematical calculations, you can bring the fire down on yourself, which is isn't a good thing to look forward to. Well, about that time, I was approached by a Major Wiener who had heard that, or had read that I had been on the list of people taking that course, and he asked me a series of questions, which were if I had any college. About that time I had had 2 years, and I had basic training as a private, and I went to OCS, and I had some languages, and I had this air-ground experience. And then he said, do you have any objections to taking parachute training? And I sort of squeezed out a weak yes. And he also said, do you have any dependents? And then I began to wonder if I really liked the situation. But he asked me if I would prefer being in an outfit where you have some discretion on your own destiny and can plan and innovate things on your mission. And that was attractive to me as compared to being in a mass movement where you had no control of what you were doing. So he ended up the interview and said, sit tight. And in the Army, you don't sit tight, you go where you're told to go. But I went back to Fort Jackson and sat tight. And can I have some water too, please? And pretty soon I got orders, very strange orders. It ordered me to a boarding house in Washington, and the people at Jackson said that was a very strange order because you usually go base to base. And when I got there, I had a message to call a telephone number. And I called it, and they told me that the next morning I would be taken for psychological training, and then after that, physical training. And the psychological training was you were all in the same kind of uniform, Army fatigues. You didn't know if the next guy was an admiral or a private or a sergeant or a major. And you had false names and a false background. I was, of all places, from Kansas. And my dad was supposed to be a professor there, and I was actually from New Jersey, and my dad was that kind of work. But you were told to keep that identity. And after about 5 days of psychological testing and playing games, which psychiatrists would observe if you were a leader or a good follower, because you don't need all leaders, you need some followers. And then we moved into a very nice place for physical evaluation. And there was a great big mansion with not much furniture, and there were people there coming back from overseas with wounds and a couple with a missing leg or so. And we had a lot of training, creeping and crawling under barbed wire and jumping off of practice towers for parachute training. And explosives going on all over the place. This beautiful lawn. I wondered what it was, and nobody inquired. It was the Congressional Country Club. It had gone bankrupt, and General Donovan had rented it for a rest home for people coming home from overseas duty, and for those training in order to go overseas. And the man in charge of the physical part of it was a fellow whose name you might recognize, the older people might recognize, Wes Fessler, who was the football coach at the U. He was an awful nice guy. The only thing I have against him is that at the end of the final softball game, we had no water, and they brought out some nice stuff to drink, and it was spiked with an awful lot of gin, and you'd take a couple of quick glassfuls, and you became a little indiscreet and disclosed your identity. And a couple of days later, we had to appear before a board. We had to appear before a board, and the who was up there on the board, but my best buddy that I thought was another person being tested, and I'd confessed to him all I knew about myself. And I thought, I've washed out of this, but they said, they had two conclusions, that you talk too much, I still do, and I don't know how to drink. So they said, watch it, be careful. So I was then sent to OSS headquarters, which was in the old area of the Naval Hospital. It's up around Georgetown, across the street from a brewery. And there I was back in uniform, and the man in charge said that there were 5 of us in our group, that we were very lucky because 109 was in town, and he'd like to talk to new arrivals. So we all went over to the next building, a Gothic-looking building, and there was 109, and it was Major General Wild Bill Donovan. And he asked me, Lieutenant, do you know why you're here? I said, no, sir. By that time, I hadn't heard of Donovan, and I hadn't heard the word OSS. I didn't know quite what it was. And he asked, do you know why you're here, Lieutenant? And I said, no, sir. He said, I don't either, but we'll find something interesting and worthwhile for you to do. And this is an example of the way they recruited. Normally in the military, you have a regiment or a battalion or a platoon that already exists, and if they have a need, they send that platoon out or send that regiment out. And the OSS method was to have a pool of all sorts of people. They had doctors, they had radio operators, demolition experts, map readers, even people they've gotten out of Alcatraz or Sing Sing who were good forgers, because we had to forge a lot of documents in the work we were doing. Well, an example of Donovan's character, there was a story told about him that his aide, his permanent aide, was a naval captain. Said he was talking to a young lieutenant, and the aide came in and said, General, we have to leave for the White House. This is our weekly briefing of the Joint Chiefs and the President on gathered intelligence. And Donovan said, the President and the Chiefs of Staff aren't going anywhere. This boy's going overseas to be behind lines. That's more important to me. So he was an expert at stepping on toes, and people said he had as many enemies in Washington as he had overseas. My first mission that they discussed with me was to go to the Philippines. If you've seen the movie South Pacific, the Navy lieutenant, Lieutenant Cable, and the Frenchmen were off on an island observing the naval ship movements. And it was that type thing that they had in mind. It was just at the beginning of training when word came from headquarters that there was a rule that any people going in for any kind of a mission from the OSS into MacArthur's territory had to be transferred to his command, and that was unacceptable. Donovan and MacArthur had been rivals from the time that Captain Donovan and Captain George Patton and Major Doug MacArthur were all under Pershing down on chasing Pancho Villas. He can confirm that. I was glad to know that. As a result of this, I was put back in the pool. I spent lots of time in pools. And I was put on a slow boat to China, down around the southern part of Australia into Calcutta. And then by log burning a train, if you would call it a train, headed up into Assam in India, which was the town of Chabwa was the jumping off place to go over the hump. The Japanese had driven Stilwell back with his poorly trained Chinese soldiers back into India, where he retrained them and eventually came back successfully and drove the Japanese back beyond the opening of the Burma Road. But there was an air base, Michinau, which nobody can spell, that had a very large airplane capability, and the Japanese were in control, and they shot down an awful lot of the C-47s and their escorts. And if the Japs didn't get them, the air currents and the bad weather got a lot more. And that passageway through the Himalayas was nicknamed the Aluminum Graveyard. But ours was kind of a pleasant flight. There was no oxygen, but we didn't have any attacks. And we landed at Kunming, and I was told to report to the head man, Colonel Hepner, and he said that they had looked at the records that came out of a new personnel arriving, and they had a job that they thought I might like. And it was, I think, the best job in the OSS and the CBI theater. It was coordinating missions, seeing that they got what they needed, and that their intelligence was passed to the right places. So the rule of thumb in OSS was need to know. You didn't know what the propaganda section was doing, or the sabotage sections, that's special ops, or the air ops. They were all separate. So there had to be some place where they could break that rule of need to know, and someone can see the whole picture to see where the need was and who had to know. And luckily I got that. And I had 3 qualifications that no one else had for that. One was I was available, because most of the people who had arrived had assignments, so I didn't. Number 2, the head man, Colonel Hepner, and the second man, Colonel Davis. Colonel's good. But they noticed that I came out of the field artillery, and they did too, so there was a bit of camaraderie. But what was the clincher was Davis, Hepner, and I all had played baseball for Princeton, and that was it. That did it. Prior to 1944, China was chaotic. There were espionages from all sides, from Chiang Kai-shek to the Mao Zedong's communists. The British had intelligence operations, the French did. And the American establishment was also a disaster, because it was in the whole theater was under Lord Mountbatten, who was British, and Stilwell was in charge of the American military mission, and he was also chief of staff of Chiang Kai-shek. And the power behind the throne of Chiang Kai-shek was an evil man. He was like Hitler's Himmler, in charge of security, and the catching a spy on the other side meant decapitation in most cases by a machete. It was not a pleasant theater that way. And to complicate matters was that the American policy was split in half. There was the China nationalist group led by people like Claire Booth Luce, and our own congressman from Minnesota was, I keep forgetting his name. Yes, right.
Walter Judd.
And they were very pro-Chiang Kai-shek. They were enthralled by Madam Chiang Kai-shek. And they financed him with loads of funds, and his nickname became Cash My Check instead of Chiang Kai-shek. Well, things changed a great deal, and luckily it was just about the same time I arrived in 1944. Stillwell, who didn't get along at all well with Chiang Kai-shek, his nickname, often stated in public, was the Peanut or the Little Dummy. And I've learned when I was a private, you don't call your superior officer those names. And so he was withdrawn. He spent most of his time in Burma and did a very fine job in Burma and was a good soldier. And he wanted to be more aggressive to push the Japanese back in China, but Chiang Kai-shek and Mao were hoarding things. Let the Westerners defeat the Japanese. We're going to hoard things so we can fight each other and get control of China after the war. So in came General Whittemire, who had been on Mountbatten's staff, along with the head OSS man stationed in Ceylon, was my boss, Stick Hepner. And he had been all through the Jedburghs, and he'd been in charge of special operations out of London for all the continent, and a real fine guy, I thought. Princetonian, you gotta be. But all this leads up to my hero, and I get a little emotional. You have to forgive me for that, because when you get old, you get emotional. Donovan came to China in April of 1945 for a visit and didn't bring an aide, so I got to be his aide. That meant I spent night and day with him for a very short period of time. But I did get to know him and had some, I think, amusing but meaningful experiences with him. He, on the same order that named me aide, they named a fellow named Paul Child, who was in charge of the secret war room, where they had a map and he moved pins. All he did all day was move pins where we had agents and operations going on. But he had a girlfriend who I worked very closely with for a year in China, named Julia McWilliams, and she became famous. And they were having a little bit of an affair, but I didn't think it was serious. And I met her years later. They were married then. Her name was Julia Childs after their marriage, after the war. And she was, people call her a spy. And there have been books about Julia Childs as a spy in China. Well, a girl 6'2" with brown hair and those funny Western eyes would be a very poor spy in China. And it was kind of earthy. I asked her when I saw her in Cambridge years later, that I told her that I could remember Paul in the war room, sort of a grouch, I thought. And Julia was about as far from me for a year to that wall. And you could always hear her. She talked rather loudly. And I said, I can remember Paul, and I can remember you so well, but separately. I didn't know you were an item. She said, well, we weren't engaged, but Paul was sniffing around. And also, she, being very modest, when people say she was a spy, I'm sure now, bless her soul, she's passed on, but she would say, I'm sure, I was no spy, I was a glorified file clerk. And that was not true. One of the main aims of Donovan in setting up the OSS was central intelligence. Prior to that time, the Army had its intelligence, State had its intelligence, and Navy had its, and the FBI had its. And they were jealous, and they had different purposes in getting intelligence. And Donovan's theory, which he got from the British, was to have a central intelligence with information always available. And an example would be with the registry that she headed was if you were to blow up a bridge up on the Yellow River, they would go to Julia. She'd know how many Japanese were nearby, what the bridge construction was, what its weak points were, how many aircraft might be available, and that was instantaneously available. That all came from secret intelligence, from agents, but also there was a body called Research and Analysis, who were professors. There was President Williams was part of it. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was part of it. And they would search all the available sources on an area that needed information and it would almost be immediately available to the registries, so you could go to one place and get all the information that you need. Back under the old system, the Army's tactical intelligence wouldn't be valuable for the need of what's the attitude of the people, what's their heritage, what's their political outlook, or their ambitions, and their historical experiences. All that was essential for an awful lot of military operations. Donovan's visit in April had three things to do, all of which were top secret. He knew about the bomb and the timing and what the plans were, and he had come to give hypothetical. He met with Mountbatten, Chiang Kai-shek, and the French people and the British people, and said, hypothetically, if the war would end soon, who would take over from the Japanese in Burma and in Laos and all those areas, including China, hypothetically, but he knew exactly what was going to happen. So they allocated responsibility for that. His other mission was to complete a report that FDR had asked for, which was what to do with the OSS function after the war. But he died, and Truman put it on the back burner. He was only in office for a short time. It began in '45, and FDR was sick, and I couldn't brief him on the purposes of the OSS or about the atomic bomb. All that hit him, as he said, like a cow fell on me. But what's my next point here? The other mission. He was to write that report, and did, and it was almost exactly what ended up in the CIA and Special Forces, because OSS was split in two parts. It was the irregular warfare and secret intelligence, which was espionage and propaganda. And there are two kinds of propaganda: white propaganda, which is just the news, but black propaganda is where you make up things that are to your benefit, lies included. And that's what our propaganda section did. And the last thing that he was there for was to organize teams to rescue POWs in Manchuria primarily, but in other places too, because intelligence showed that the Japanese pattern was to either execute the prisoners at the end of the war, or to leave them, abandon them to starve, or to have another death march. So it was very critical. It'll be described in next month's session here. It's an exciting period, and there such names appear in that as John Birch, who's most people think was a bad rightist, extreme anti-communist, and he was actually a Baptist missionary who saved Colonel Doolittle and his crew, led them back to Kunming, and got the Legion of Merit for that. And then he joined the 14th Air Force as a lieutenant in intelligence, identifying targets and getting a network of agents all through China. And he was on his way to a mission to secure the area around Port Arthur at the end of the war, and he was interrupted by Mao Zedong's men, and he being a bit arrogant and speaking perfect Chinese, insisted on going forward, and they shot him in the hip and ordered him to walk with them, and he refused. So they tied his hands behind his back and made him kneel and bashed in his face with bayonets so he wouldn't be recognized, and then shot him in the head. And there's a society named the John Birch Society, and it has his name. He had nothing to do with it. He was dead many years before it was founded, but they took the name because he was the first American killed by a communist military.
Bob, I missed some slides. I've got Donovan up here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, do you have Donovan up there?
Donovan is up there, but you wanted to...
He's my hero. And the second one is Ho Chi Minh was definitely a communist when he was a young man in Paris, and then he had some time in Moscow. but the OSS thought, he regarded communism as a way to liberation of Vietnam. And he was asked the Americans if he could have copies of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And he did a lot of intelligence work for General Chennault. And he had his picture taken shaking hands with Chennault. And Chennault gave him some pistols to give to his leaders as a symbol of his friendship with the Americans. And he wrote a letter. He aided very much in rescuing down pilots and identifying targets and organizing a network of agents. And at the end of the war, well, during this mission of rescuing prisoners, one of our teams landed in Saigon, and he protected them, thinking that they were going to be great allies in the future. But word came from Washington that the fellow was in charge there was Archimedes Patty, and Archie sort of exceeded his authority and was making Ho Chi Minh an ally. And word came from Washington that that's the wrong way to go, that he's the enemy, and that the old friends of the Empire days were going to be the people we were dealing with. So get Archimedes out of there. And but at the same time, our other hero, Aaron Banks, who'd been at Jetberg, working with the Maquis, and then he went to Yugoslavia and organized a system for rescuing down pilots. And he was very highly regarded. And he came to Burma and worked along with Colonel Eiler in driving back the Japanese, and learned a lot about jungle warfare. And he became the founder, the recognized founder, and there's a statue of him life-size at the entrance to the area of the Green Berets at Fort Bragg. And by the way, in the new OSS building, in the vestibule is the life-size statue of Wild Bill Donovan, as a recognized founder of the CIA. So,
Bob, I've got photo 3 up there. It's Donovan being welcomed.
yes, that's Donovan in his favorite suit, which is non-regulation to the extreme, with red, white, and blue socks. I was told on the first day that Donovan was there, Colonel Hebner said that tomorrow he's to wear his dress uniform because he had a lot of things scheduled. And Donovan told me, tell your Colonel Hebner that, well, they were actually law partners in the same firm, but he held him at arm's length for appearance's sake. He said, he can decide what he's going to wear, and I'm a general, and I'm going to decide what I'm going to wear. So I hung up his nice new uniform out of the closet, and he turned that down and got back into that bush suit. So, number 5 is a picture of me up there. You can see how when you get to be 90, you don't look much like you looked when you were 21.
And which are you the one holding the box?
Yes.
In the middle.
And that's Donovan handing out the medals. And the first one he's talking to is Colonel Cox, who is the fellow in charge of special operations and operational groups. He was a real hero.
Okay, now I now have photo 7 up, which is your girlfriend Julia.
Yes, Julia, and that was a terrible photograph. Yep, that's them.
And that's is that her husband Paul? Or
that's her husband Paul. And in the movie, Paul looked too nice, but it was good acting. And Julia looked a little bit flighty, and she was no dummy. She was a very able lady. Oh, I have 3 security stories, which I hope they won't take long. The one was a haircut story. On the first night, the general said, "Do we have a barber, Lieutenant?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, have him here in the morning because I need a haircut and a shave." And so I had 2 alternatives. We had Doberman pincers, and the corporal in charge had done a little hair cutting. But I asked him, and he would say, "Oh, I couldn't cut his hair. I'd be too nervous." So I brought in the fellow from the town of Kunming, who was a tall, about 60-year-old Chinese guy with a smock, with a little squiggly beard, and he came in his ding house and opened up his pigskin satchel and took out a straight razor and some scissors. And Donovan said, "Is this one of our men, Lieutenant?" And I said, "Well, he cuts our hair, sir." And he said, "Has he been cleared for security?" I said, "Oh, I don't think so." And he said, "You're going to let him around my neck with those?" "No, sir." And so luckily the corporal was standing by, and he did the job. He shaved him, and I thought, I'm going to get court-martialed, or at least get sent back to the States or back to the artillery, or something bad, or chewed out like the devil. And all Donovan did was said, the corporal would have been a better first choice, don't you think so, Lieutenant? And I knew what he meant. He was that was a lashing, but in the way he did it. And the next morning, he was kidding me, but I didn't know it. I'm holding. He said, "How secure are we here?" I said, "Oh, we got." The compound has walls around it, and we have an officer of the day with guards, and we have the Doberman pincers. And he said, "Well, I'm holding you personally responsible." And I think that was just a lesson about security. But he said, he told my colonel in the morning at breakfast, "You know what the kid did last night? I tried to get out. I was kidding him about security, and I tried to get out of my room to go to the bathroom, and I couldn't get out, and I peered around, and he'd moved his bed up against the door." What could I do? I had to do something, but it was sort of silly. And but I got back at him in a way. I shouldn't tell this, but he's passed on, and everyone else has passed on. But we had a flood, and we couldn't eat in the compound because of pollution. So they made arrangements to go into town, and they had cleared out a room of all Chinese at noontime. And we went in and ate, and Donovan wouldn't leave his briefcase with this information about the rescue of the prisoners and the atomic bomb data, and in his report, all of this, it was too secure to leave it back at headquarters. He carried it himself into the restaurant. And after we were through, we got back in the car, and he leaned forward. The general sits in the back, and Hepner was up front and said, "Dick, do you have the briefcase?" He said, "No, sir." And "Lieutenant, do you have the briefcase?" "No, sir." And none of us had the guts to say, "You had it." But we went. He said, "Well, we'll go back and get it." And so we drove back, and I ran in, and the room was full of Chinese, all laughing and saying "Ding Hao." And I said "Ding Hao," and picked up the briefcase from under the table and got back in the car, and there was a period of silence. And Donovan said, "I won't tell anybody if you don't."
Wayne Johnson was born on a little farm in Ortonville, Minnesota, went to high school in Chicago, graduated from Johnson School, was inducted into the service, and volunteered on December 8th, as many people did, was inducted February 42, went to basic training at Jefferson Barracks, was spotted as having some potential, so he was sent, since he had no college education at that point, was sent to the Michigan School of Mines in Houghton, Michigan for 6 months. Then was sent down for primary flight in PT-17s in Clarksville, Mississippi. Was then into basic training in Greenville, Mississippi with BT-13s. And by the way, I don't know if you know, I don't know if any of the people are here in the audience, but the group that built the glider is now building a BT-13. So we'll have to, when the weather gets better, we'll do a little rendezvous and go up and see what the guys are doing. He then went into advanced training at Greenwood with T6s and finished in late 42 in P-40s. He was then transferred down to Sarasota, Florida for gunnery and tactics in P-40s, and then back up to Meridian, Mississippi in the 118th Recon Squadron with P-40s and P-51s. He flew in a C-54, the 4-engine planes, from the States to Brazil, to the Azores, ended up in Casablanca. I think we had somebody else that ended up there, right, Marty? And then boarded a C-47, which took him from Casablanca to Cairo to Karachi, Pakistan. Wayne, I'm going to let you jump in and tell about what you did with stealing a general's Jeep in Karachi.
I didn't steal it. We just liberated it. A group, 4 of us, had won an aerobatic contest at a field about 20 miles out in the desert from Karachi. And so we were invited into the general's headquarters, and he lived in or had his headquarters in a beautiful castle that he'd taken over from a Maharaja. And he drank scotch. So everybody at the party had to drink scotch. Well, I had never tasted scotch in my life, but it didn't take very many drinks on the 4 of us to kind of get us out of hand. And there were about 40 or 50 of the most beautiful women I have ever seen collected there. And I guess we got a little too friendly with them. So we were invited outside to get in a truck and go back to our camp. And that would be a real dusty ride. And there was a nice Jeep sitting in the driveway, and nobody was using it. So we jumped in it, and it was up on a high hill, and we got it rolling, and it went by the Sikh guards at the bottom, probably going about 50 or 60. And I lost my cap someplace along the route. It blew off. And as we went through the gate at our camp, of course, it was easy to recognize my white hair. I was the only white-headed guy on the base. And so we ran and jumped in bed, and about 5 minutes later, the MPs were there and took us over to headquarters. And very fortunate for me, the commander of the base was an officer that I had done a favor for in Sarasota. So he said, Whitey, you are the luckiest SOB in the Army. I'm going to get you out of here before the general's MPs get here. And he told his aide, he said, go put him on the first airplane that leaves here. And I don't give a damn where it's going, but put him on that plane and don't let him stop and even take a pee from here to the airplane. Well, I ended up in Kunming, China, the headquarters of the Flying Tigers 14th Air Force, with no orders. And General Chennault, the commander, always had the habit of meeting all pilots that came into the theater. And there were about 20 or 30 of us lined up in the morning, and the general came down the line and would stop and talk to each guy for a few minutes. And he came up to me, and he had the most black, piercing eyes. And if you've seen pictures of General Chennault, he has a very rugged countenance. And he stood there just about this far from me, and he's staring at me. And I thought, oh, Jesus, he heard about that Jeep. But finally he said, son, what did you do before you got in the Army and where you're from? And I was able to stammer out that I was from a farm in Minnesota. And he said, good, farm boys make good pilots. They know what the sound of an engine means. And then he said, where are your orders? Where are you going? And I was shaking pretty bad. And I finally was able to stammer out that my orders someplace got misplaced. And he turned to his aide and he said, send them out to McComas. And McComas was the commander of a squadron out in far eastern China in what they called the pocket, where the base was surrounded by Jap troops within about 50 miles. But he was a great tactical commander. And one of the first missions that I was on, there were 8 P-51s, and we raided a Japanese airfield near Shanghai. They had just moved in a bunch of airplanes from Formosa because they suspected that the Americans were going to invade the east coast of China. And all these airplanes were lined up in beautiful rows. And normally, if we strafed an airfield, we would make one pass and then get the hell out of there. But nobody was shooting at us, so we kept making passes, and we destroyed 94 of the airplanes on the ground, and 3 in the air without a loss of any of ours. A very successful mission.
And you were in the 75th Fighter Group.
On that mission, I was in the 118th TAC Recon, but later I was transferred to the 75th. The 75th Fighter Squadron was commanded by Tex Hill. You've probably heard of his name. He was the leading ace in China and was a great commander. He could drink more whiskey than any man I ever saw. And he never looked like he had a drink. There were quite a few picturesque characters in the Air Force. There was a guy that we called Earthquake Magoon. His name was Earl McGovern, but he looked much like the cartoon that was famous in those days. And one of the characters there was Earthquake Magoon, who made moonshine. And so McGovern had set up a still and was making moonshine. Very powerful stuff. And he'd drink a little of it himself. And on this particular mission, he was in the cockpit of a P-40, ready to go, or in a P-51, and he started throwing up. So the flight commander pulled him out of the plane, and I was just standing there quite close, and he said, "Whitey, jump in there and take that plane." Well, I hadn't been in on the briefing. I knew they were going to Shanghai, but that's all I knew. But I flew along and was on that very famous mission that Chenault said was by far the most successful mission of the war. Most pilots in the early days of the war always had the hope that they could be sent to China to fly under Chenault because he had a reputation as a great tactical commander and a good guy to serve under. He had written some articles called The Role of Defensive Pursuit. There was a group of bomber pilots that were in control of the Air Force, and they thought that bombers could go to target, bomb the target, and return safely. Well, they learned very early in the war that they had staggering losses until they, Doolittle, who was then in command of the Air Corps in China or in India and England, said that they could not go safely without fighter escort. So from then on, all bombing missions were escorted by fighters, mostly P-40s or P-51s. And their losses fell dramatically then.
You had some other major characters, Wiedemeyer and Mountbatten, I think you met?
Yeah, Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten was the commander of the British and English forces in the theater. And he came up to Kunming to visit with Chenault. And I was in a group of 4 P-51s that escorted them partway over the hump. And when he landed at Kunming, and we landed there also, he came over to us and he said, I'm told I should congratulate you chaps for getting me safely over the hump. And he had seen, he was flying as the co-pilot in the plane, and he had seen the Japanese planes trying to attack, and we were successful in that they didn't accomplish their mission. When they saw us diving towards them, they turned and ran. So he was happy that we were there, but he just said, I guess I'm supposed to congratulate you chaps for what you did. So that was my meeting with Lord Mountbatten. Stilwell was the ground commander in the area, and he and Chenault didn't get along at all. They just were at odds all the time because Stilwell, as the aerial commander, controlled the distribution of supplies, of ammunition, bombs, and that type of thing. And so he was always at odds with Chenault. One of the most grouchy guys I think I ever met. He never smiled. He wore, and he'd chew us out if we took the grommet out of our hat to make it look like this. And he wanted us to keep that grommet in so that the cap had a flat top. But he had that damned old plug hat that he wore all the time, which wasn't regulation at all.
Did you have meet with Wiedemeyer?
Yes, Wiedemeyer came in right near the end of the war. They retired Chenault in July of 45, so he was not there to get the taste of the victory. And Wiedemeyer came in, and also Stratemeyer. We had an interesting meeting with Wiedemeyer. 4 of us had gone down to Calcutta to pick up some airplanes. And on the way back, and this character that we called Earthquake Lagoon was leading our flight. And he had heard, where we stopped to gas up, that the war was about over, and there was going to be a group of our high-ranking people taking over in Shanghai. And so he decided we just should divert a ways and fly to Shanghai. We were supposed to go to a field down by Hong Kong. So that was probably 1,000 miles that we diverted. And when Wiedemeyer and Stratemeyer's plane came in, and some other people for the surrender, the 4 P-51s were sitting there on the runway. And he was curious who we were, and we told his aide that we'd been sent over to escort his group in and be sure and protect them when he landed. Well, that wasn't quite the case. And we had been in there, we'd been there about 4 days when he came in. And we were staying in this real beautiful hotel. And they were serving us the finest food and the nicest drinks. And all we did was shine the chits. And when he saw us signing these chits, he said, "What the hell's going on here?" And we said, "We don't know. They just would come and give us these slips and told us to sign them." So he said, "Well, boys, you can't do that anymore." So he sent us back to our base.
We have some slides here. This is an advertisement for your book, right?
Yes,
That tells all the stories.
that's for 3 of my brothers, and I'm the little white-headed guy. And I don't have a cap. My mother made all of our clothes, and you notice the overalls are all the same, and I think they were the same size because some are much too short, and some of us littler guys are too long.
And that's called hand-me-downs, right?
Yes. And my mother was very unhappy with me because I lost my cap. And that was a lot of work for her to make those caps. The picture below, of course, is the P-51 with the black lightning stripes on it. We called our squadron the Black Lightning Squadron. And this is a model of a P-51D model with the black lightning stripes. And one of the high-ranking officers told our commander, "You really shouldn't have that black lightning stripe because the Japanese can easily identify you." And he said, "That's what we want them to do."
Coming back to Marty, and then we're going to open it up for a question and answer. Marty moved to the Pacific. The war was over. He didn't have a lot more excitement at that point. But he came back, got his engineering degree, Clarkson, New York, master's degree at Northeastern, worked on the New Jersey-New York turnpikes. 1961, he came to Minnesota. He was the engineer on the Bong Bridge up in between Duluth and Superior. He is the engineer for the Lowry Tunnel, if you know, that goes through downtown Minneapolis, the bridges. And one of the fine people. I hope you'll come up and say something later to him. Bob Maynard came back on the GI Bill, finished his degree at Princeton, went on to Harvard Law School, went to the corporate counsel for United Shoe Machinery, was a vice president and corporate counsel until they were split up as a part of government antitrust. 1975, he came to Minnesota, where he became vice president, secretary, and general counsel for Honeywell. And Whitey. Yeah. I flew for 2 years in the North Dakota National Guard, P-51s. Came to the University of Minnesota, got his law degree in '52, went up to Beaver Bay, Silver Bay, was city engineer and had a law practice up on the Iron Range. So we're going to stop right now to allow some time for questions.
I'm a younger guy. I do not know that nomenclature. What does OSS stand for?
It stands for, legally, it stands for Office of Strategic Services, things that the Army cannot normally do, like operate behind lines, espionage, sabotage things beneath the dignity and the reputation. And the State Department for Intelligence shouldn't have spies, but OSS would do those nasty things. But the opposition of the OSS said OSS stood for "oh so social" because most of the recruiting was done on the East Coast because of transportation, and they had to be near where headquarters was. The other people called it "oh so silly" because they did some outlandish things like attach incendiaries to bats and hoping that, and release them near Japan, hoping they'd fly down and set things on fire, and that didn't work at all. But I think there was oh so social, oh so secret, and oh so silly. It was oh so secret because they had no press conferences, and as a result, the press was hostile. And they painted Donovan as a pre-Nazi and had Gestapo-type ideas, but he had no plans for operations in the United States. It was all outside the United States. And I forgot, if I can add a little something here, that Donovan is the only man who's ever received all 4 of the top American medals, including the Medal of Honor. And these are just 4 quotes. I thought it was great, but this last page. It's the he was always a rival of MacArthur's because MacArthur was from West Point and high military standing. Donovan was National Guard and worked his way up, and he got 3 Purple Hearts in World War I as a colonel, and there aren't many colonels who get Purple Hearts, but he was in the trenches with his men. And there was a movie, The Fighting 69th, which stars Cagney and Pat O'Brien, and it's about Donovan's outfit in the Fighting 69th. The other comment was from Lord Mountbatten, who was always in conflict because he was protecting imperialistic advantages, and Roosevelt, after the Atlantic Charter and the meeting at Casablanca, said that our purpose is liberation and free determination. But Lord Mountbatten said, this man wasn't just a great American, he was a great international citizen of enormous courage, leadership, and vision. I doubt whether any person contributed more to the ultimate Allied victory than Bill Donovan. And I don't think I quoted MacArthur. He said, Bill Donovan was the most determined, resourceful, and gallant soldier I ever met. And President Eisenhower, when he learned that Donovan had died, said, what a man, we've lost the last hero.
The OSS was disbanded after World War II by Harry Truman, and then activated again under who?
2 months later, under Truman, after he learned that OSS was not what it was represented to be by Donovan's critics.
And it's now called the CIA.
That's, yeah, and well, it's called the CIA in both the irregular warfare type things, that's special ops, and also in the espionage part. But the real military part of the OSS has gone to the Army, and the more diplomatic aspects of the intelligence side has gone to State Department.
Okay. Well, listen, March 13th, Operation Cobra. We'll have another great panel of veterans. And I do want to tell you that Bob and Whitey are going to be on the 27th. We're going to do the war in China. and they're going to have some different stories to tell. Thank you for coming. See ya later.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.